Charles, how much damage is done by technical energy consumption?
So, just to preface this, according to the United Nations Climate Report, 2023 was the hottest year ever recorded, and 2024 is on track to surpass it. The damage that is being done to the environment is real, measurable, and catastrophic in its implications. The data center specifically, the data center use of energy specifically, is not the leading contributor to this global rise in temperatures, but it is not insignificant either. The data centers themselves are exploding in production. We have new data centers being built by Meta, Google, Microsoft, and several other cloud companies all across the United States, in Wyoming, Virginia, all set to be built next year. Same thing with Latin America and Asian countries. The scale of production of these data centers is an absolute cause for concern. It's not just energy, it is also water, contributing to global drought conditions that have been significantly worsened in 2023, and again on track to surpass it in 2024. These data centers require massive amounts of water for cooling all of their server racks, and the server racks themselves are designed for fault tolerance, specifically if their hardware fails. If their hardware fails, the hardware needs to be replaced. Replaced by what? Highly complicated technical components that are made from rare earth materials that are mined in dangerous mining conditions in places where there is potentially slave labor being abused. So every single time one of these data centers is constructed, imagine a multivariant attack on the current deteriorating state of the global climate.
What a way to start our discussion. We are going to dive into each one of those sections as well over the next couple minutes or so. Charles, when you're talking about this consumption, there's some stats here. Microsoft, 30% CO2 emissions increase over a very short period of time. Google, 50% increase from 2019 to 2023. The data centers that you're talking about, can we take a quick step back? When you say data centers, what does that mean?
So a data center is a facility for mostly cloud computing.
Mhm.
They are big facilities that provide the hardware necessary to run software in the cloud, software that you are running on another machine. These data centers are essentially filled with server racks where computer chips run, and they have special technicians and facilities that are there to make sure that they keep running. It is offloading the responsibility of maintaining the hardware from the people who run the software to the cloud computing company. This has the potential to be a very energy efficient system, but the scale of production and specifically the kinds of software that are currently being run are making this system a climate disaster.
When you're explaining a data center and you're talking about, okay, cool, everything's being stored in one area. Ideally, that's more efficient than all of us keeping our own little mini centers, right? But yet the desire, I guess, for more and more and more is really what's adding to some of this, correct?
Yeah, it doesn't. Yes, correct. It doesn't matter that the computing is being done more efficiently, which it always is. Hardware always improves. It's the fact that the scale of production is outpacing the efficiency gains of whatever efficiency tools we're using in this context.
Fair enough, and that's good to know because we're going to be talking more and more about that usage. And hey, look, wait a second, better technology should be efficient. So why are we getting worse and worse with it? So let me jump over to Jamison. Thanks, Charles. When we say energy consumption, we'll take it a step back even more so. What does that mean, and what is actually being consumed?
Right. So breaking this down, doing consumption first. So consumption is going to refer to the use, specifically in the tech industry, of energy, which is another general term, and we'll break that down too, to power devices such as the server racks that Charles was talking about in the data centers, infrastructure, so the building itself and everything that it takes to cool the building as well as those servers, and any other operations within technology. So still a pretty wide range, and as you guys said before, growing wider as we start to use this technology more and it becomes more widespread. But what exactly is being consumed when it comes to energy? First and foremost, electricity, for sure. That's the primary energy source. And that is most often, especially still today, derived from fossil fuels, but also renewables and a little bit of nuclear energy as well. In terms of fuel for that, for backup systems like diesel generators or direct operations in certain industrial processes, specifically, again, for those data centers, we need backup for sure, of course. So if any of the actual electricity goes down, we still are able to keep those servers running. Right? And then we have natural resources like coal, oil, natural gas, uranium, because nuclear isn't actually a renewable energy, even if it is very efficient. Uranium is not a renewable resource. And other minerals used in renewables, like lithium for batteries. So there's a lot of sources of energy, of course, and there's a lot of ways that we can get that energy from those sources. But in a lot of cases, when it comes to where the industry is right now, we tend to use the most tried and true sources, which often tend to be the most destructible towards the environment. In terms of broader impacts here, in terms of what we're talking about for the environment, we're talking about carbon emissions, resource depletion, again, for non-renewable resources, and again, the environmental impact from that as well.
So it's not just one energy source. It's pulling from all these. And I was actually researching just even crypto energy, where it comes from. Gas, coal, solar, nuclear, wind, hydro, and then other. And when we're talking about all these different resources coming to one area, there are some issues. And I actually want to bounce to Christina, then potentially back to you here, Jamison. Christina, where are these resources being taken from?
So that is a loaded question, and just the amount of resources we use are various, as Jamison and you, Rich, have mentioned. It's breaking down into 3 different categories: fossil fuels, nuclear, and renewable resources. Each one of those are going to be sourced from different places. Focusing just on fossil fuels, though, that is coal, natural gas, and petroleum, all of which are basically sourced from underground. These are resources that are made from old plant and animal matter that have been buried underground, underneath shale stone and sedimentary rock. And once it's encompassed by these rocks, it naturally turns into either petroleum, coal, or natural gas. So in order to access that material, we do have to dig underground to gain it. And it's mostly seen in the middle of the country, actually. There's 2 or 3, I believe, different ridges where we see the most gas. It's going to be the Appalachia region, the Permian Basin, and the Haynesville Shale. Those last 2 are located like around Texas and span into those 2 neighboring states. And then the first one is ranging from New York down to Pennsylvania, West Virginia, along the Appalachian Mountains. But basically, to get these resources, we have to dig underneath the shale stone and frack for them, use fracking techniques, which is blasting water, chemicals, and sand at these rocks in order to break them apart, fracture them, and access the materials that lay underneath or within them. And that in of itself is an absolute nightmare for the environment. In terms of renewable resources, though, that's going to be wide ranges: wind, wood, water, and those are obvious where they come from.
There's a lot to unpack between these last two discussions here, or questions here. First off, when we're looking at all these different areas, what are like the actual environmental impacts? So, as they're fracking, as they're taking all this water, even just right before here, I was on Reddit and I was seeing pictures of these lakes that are at levels that they haven't been since 200, 300 years ago. As we're seeing these, what are the environmental impacts? Let's say just at a local level.
So we see the impact in three main areas: the air, the water, and the soil. Since we mentioned the water, let's just talk about that for now, because for example, to put things in perspective, there was a recent fracking project in Canada that used 16 million gallons of water. And that's a lot of water. Putting that into perspective, the average US household only uses 300 gallons of water. So a lot more than a single household, a lot more than, honestly, a city, about the size of a city. So the amount of water that's just being used is draining these lakes, as you mentioned, and it's also being used to carry and blast the rocks with these different chemicals. So the chemicals that are blasting the rock, all of those chemicals aren't going to be safe. Really, honestly, the interesting, sad, funny, however you want to think about it thing is these mining companies, these fracking companies don't actually have to release all of the chemicals that they include in the mixtures that they use for fracking. So every company, in a recent study, they found that most companies did not list at least one ingredient. Like, they didn't name what the ingredient was, and they listed it as a trade secret that they couldn't share in order to protect their finances. But regardless of that, the chemicals that we know they are using is going to be things like methanol, ethylene glycol, and propyl alcohol. I butchered that last one, but all of these chemicals, well, okay, they're not all toxic, but one of them, super toxic. Methanol will cause blindness and is considered highly toxic to humans. And the last one, that alcohol, is also pretty toxic. So the other two aren't really safe for you to be handling about, really. Like, you should not pick up a pool of it with your hands and say you're going to be safe. Regardless, this is not stuff that we should be releasing into our environment at the rate that we do, because when we blast the rocks with these chemicals, we cause fissures in the rock, and these fractures, these fissures, can extend past the points of where we expect it. And when that happens, it's going to carry the chemicals to local groundwaters, lakes, creeks, and pollute the water with those chemicals. On top of that, just fracking for this is releasing gas into the atmosphere. We are mining for natural gas, which is just methane. So if we're mining for methane, we're going to be releasing some methane into the environment just from the process of mining for it. So that's messing with the air. The water is getting polluted from the chemicals that we are using to frack, and is leaching through the soil. The soil's getting polluted from all of those water chemicals being released into the soil. The soil filters water and will pick up those chemicals. And this happens even more if the well breaks that you are using to frack liquids, because we're drilling into the ground, blasting rocks with water. And if that well breaks, it leaches water. So locally, fracking can cause so many issues.
Wow. Okay. So this is not going to be a happy discussion, I guess, on our episode today. So you have deforestation, soil degradation, water pollution. A lot of it is fresh water that's also being utilized. And with all these different chemicals that are in the ground being up in the air, then you're getting a little bit of a hotter atmosphere, leading to even more challenges. Jumping back to Jamison. Jamison, I want to ask you a question because I thought you would find this interesting. Thank you for that breakdown, Christina. I'm curious about the regulation aspect of these data centers. And because going through some stats, you see that a Google data center in Finland is apparently 97% carbon free. And they keep mentioning how they're going green with other data centers. I guess Amazon's going to have objective, I guess you could say, of 2025 next year. Microsoft and Google, other data centers by 2030. However, I also saw that, guess what? Other data centers not in maybe more regulated areas, even the ones that just hide one secret sauce recipe in their fracking, like a facility in Asia. that relies on fossil fuels. They don't really mention that one so much, but they're utilizing it just so. Is there almost a game with the regulation aspect of this, Jamison?
I'd say certainly. I think there are two advantages when it comes to having areas that are regulated for these kinds of renewable energies towards these kinds of renewable energies. For one thing, all of the newer data centers, they have sort of these partner projects where they're bringing up solar farms or wind farms very close nearby in the places that you mentioned, of course. For one main reason, they're incentivized primarily by tax incentives, monetary incentives in general to do this, as well as PR. I think is the other main advantage in saying, hey, we're green, we're doing renewable stuff in the places where it is most visible, mainly because they can then say, hey, we're reducing our carbon footprint. We're a green company, even though we're one of the largest tech companies on the planet and we're consuming a whole bunch of energy. We're still green because we're making solar farms and wind farms. And I think part of that is due to regulation, and but it's mostly opportunism for these companies, where it's cheaper for them in areas where it's not as regulated. They will go back to previous energy resources that we have been using for a long time because the infrastructure is there. We understand the logistics of getting coal to and from different places, how we can get coal, where we can get coal, all of that kind of stuff, and for oil. And those systems are already there. It's much more expensive to try and use newer sources of energy or more current sources of energy because you have to set up wind farms, because you have to set up solar farms. But again, in places where it's regulated, in places where it's visible, that is a good opportunity for them to take advantage of that. Whereas in places like Asia, where the regulations and the visibility are much lower and less strict, then they can just go back to using the more efficient method cost-wise for themselves.
And even in the United States, there's issues with the electrical grid. The electrical grid was built for a predictable central power where they're getting their energy, aka coal and natural gas. And Christina mentioned a lot of those areas specifically. So even when you are bringing in this renewable energy and solar and wind, they can't even get to the electrical grid. They can't hold more, right? They can't get to the locations of those. But we might dive more into that later. Thanks for that, Jamison. Charles, I want to kind of bring us back to this technical piece even more about like, where is this energy consumption going? And me and you have talked about this at great lengths about the amount of energy being used by Gen AI and cryptocurrency specifically. It's almost scary. I know you're about to tell us that. Can you highlight these two technical consumers and their usage specifically, please?
So I mentioned at the top the nature of the jobs being run, the nature of what is being asked of these data centers. Both cryptocurrency and generative AI rely on massive just instances of repeated calculations. So to put it very broad, to put it very, simply, cryptocurrency involves doing millions upon billions of redundant calculations to ensure the integrity of the blockchain because it's decentralized, so every single instance has to validate and calculate every single other instance. These are redundant and largely unnecessary calculations, and they're just soaking up electricity because the fantasy of cryptocurrency is that it's immune to Hollywood style man in the middle hacking attempts. It is very good at resisting that problem that basically never happens, but it's very bad at resisting the actual problem of the planet becoming uninhabitable. Generative AI is, unlike cryptocurrency, generative AI does provide some use to the world, and it is also reliant on these very similar kinds of calculations. You have these billions of nodes of data, and each of those nodes has to calculate its relationship to each other node. Again, very, very simply here, but you can imagine that this is an exponentially complicated process. And since the people who are making these generative AI models don't really know how they work, the only solution to make them better is to make them bigger. And every single bigger model is yet another exponential increase in the amount of memory that you need in order to maintain the model. So these kinds of calculations, as demand increases, the energy requirement is exponentially related to the amount of demand, and as demand increases, they keep advertising that they're going, to the moon or whatever they're saying these days. The energy increase is going to follow suit.
Even with an efficient Lambo that they go to the moon in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to some stats here. So the current stat that I saw, AI is using 2 to 3% of all global emissions. 2 to 3%. Does that sound realistic? Do you know, let's say what's the difference in multiples that a query in Gen AI uses, I guess, energy as opposed to a Google search? It has to be some large amount, right?
The last number that I heard was about 10% more energy. And the insidious thing that's happening is that now all Google searches have the AI summary. You can no longer opt out of actively contributing to the destruction of our planet.
So does that mean now I'm not only just getting the energy use for the AI query, but also the Google search query as well?
The thing about queries is that they're actually really efficient. The Google maintained, essentially a massive lookup table, and those kinds of traditional algorithms are pretty they're pretty energy efficient. They scale well with demand. AI does not scale well with demand. As AI demand goes up, the energy required is x squared relationship as opposed to a linear relationship with, just the more you have to query from in a traditional query, it's a pretty predictable increase in energy demands, whereas, as I said, AI is an exponential increase in demand as what is being queried increases and the number of queries increase.
And then on top of that is when you're training this data set. So again, throwing some more stats at you, ChatGPT 4 uses 50 times more electricity than GPT-3 did to get trained. And so then these models, you might be coming at some type of limit here, but these models are just using 50 times more electricity with each upgrade. Is this accurate?
Yeah. Well, again, the problem with getting actual numbers on this is that every entity involved in this discussion is incentivized to fib. Yeah. OpenAI is incentivized to lie about how much energy they use because that doesn't look good from a PR perspective. And the agencies that are sounding the alarm about how disastrous this all is are inclined to give the absolute upper limit on how much energy it could possibly use because we have to rally the public to understand the danger here. So the more dramatic sounding the number, the more, headlines that'll grab. And at this point, we have to start grabbing headlines.
And I'm going to give you one more headline then that's going to grab it here. I don't know if any of you ever read Knowledge at Wharton. It's a pretty interesting website. And there's a recent article from there. And it says the training stage of GPT-3 emits 502 metric tons of CO2, which is similar to 112 gasoline cars being used for the whole year, right? So there's some other stats that go along with it. But Charles, before we go to that next question, crypto, is there a larger concern with crypto use? I mean, obviously both are concerning, but is cryptocurrency a lot more energy consumed?
It's kind of that's kind of a hard question to answer, but crypto is well, the thing with crypto is that because it is decentralized, it's hard, like you're not going to be able to look at here's how much Microsoft is using, here's how much Google is using. There's like anyone with enough millions of dollars can open a crypto farm, and that is going to, wreck the local power grid, destroy the local environment. I was reading an article about the town of Granbury, Texas, where the noise pollution is so bad from the fans of a local crypto farm that people are getting like migraines, insomnia, numerous other health problems.
Wow.
And the residents say that it is never quiet in their town because of the constant droning of the fans from the crypto mine. And again, I'm significantly less sympathetic to cryptocurrency than I am to generative AI, because cryptocurrency only serves as an investment. Generative AI has all of this promise, this potential, these things that they're saying that it can do someday, maybe. But again, cryptocurrency is just some people's money.
Got it. Jump on over to Christina, but I'm going to use this as a segue here. There actually is now a website, I'll share it right here, that is tracking Bitcoin mining and its annual, electricity usage that it's using. Currently, and right now we're in the middle of a Bitcoin, bull run. It is matching Poland's annual power consumption. Poland is being spent on crypto mining just for Bitcoin, because as Charles just shared, you can't track all those altcoins. Anybody could be doing those on the side. So very interesting. Christina, why I want to segue that is how much more can be consumed? And then when do we get a point, where are we at that point where there's just no turning back?
So how much more can be consumed is going to just depend on if we can get our act together, in my personal opinion. Looking at how just the US in of itself deals with creating energy is kind of annoying to understand. Because we do not create energy as a country and distribute it as a country. What we do is we have regions that produce the power for that region, and then those regions have a choice of if they would like to sell their excess powers to neighboring regions or other regions at auctions. Because we do have a requirement that each region produces enough power to meet the energy demands and also meet the forecasted energy demands and have a little bit of a excess just in case of an emergency happening. Now, I bring that up because that is where we have to look at on how much power is actually being produced. Those regions are deciding based on how much power is being used each year, how much they are going to create, and then how much they're going to sell. So, one, having more communication between different states on how that energy is being used, because not all of the energy that's being produced is being used across the country. So what I mean is our two top producers of energy are Texas and Pennsylvania. Texas is number one, Pennsylvania is number one. Although funny enough, I believe Texas is number two in terms of consumption, but number one is California. Now, Texas produces a lot more energy than they use, but if their power fails, then they have big problems because they are not connected to our power grid, which we saw in the big winter storm back a couple of years ago. Now, all that information points us to if we could distribute this energy that's already existing in excess across the country, that could carry us kind of a band-aid to the problem, but the real solution is going to be having that energy that's distributed as needed evenly across the country. You know, as much energy is needed for technology use by the average person or company, or however we want to do it, having that distribution, and also switching to 100% renewable energy, because renewable energy is going to be absolutely key. If we have renewable energy, there's not a concern as much of those pollutants leaking out into the environment. And renewable energy isn't as inefficient as people may think. Like, most of our energy, 60% of it is produced through fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are used to generate steam turbines or used to power steam turbines. So we create energy by creating steam, which gets converted back into energy. So that is at about, I believe, a 40% efficiency. If we use oil, it's 40% efficiency. So we put in 100% of oil, we get about 40% of its worth back in energy. Coal is about 33% efficient, and gas is 33 to 43%. Now, on our renewable side, nuclear is 33% efficient also. Hydro, water power is 90% efficient, and wind power is like 35 to 47% efficient, and solar is 18 to 25%. But at the moment, renewable resources only constitute about 21% of the US energy production. So increasing that number is just going to increase the amount of renewable clean energy sources, and we can easily expand those renewable resources. The wind turbines we can place in more area, empty land in America. Hydropower can be more looked at, more invested. Nuclear power is not to be feared, it's to be expanded. But there's so much more we can do. We just have to not let our short-sighted greed outweigh the potential collective organization that we can do as a people to fix this issue.
Nicely said. I have a couple of follow-up questions for you. I've been interested in the electrical grid a little bit more recently, and nuclear, which we'll cover in a second. So my understanding, though, is that currently there may be enough providers of renewable energy. However, it just cannot get to the electrical grid. Is that because of what you shared, that there are certain locations that house that electrical grid that we just can't get the energy to it? Also, obviously, capacity levels that we talked about earlier, but can it just not even get to the electrical grid?
So my understanding of it is that the electrical grid that we have is currently owned by those regions that are using coal, usually fossil fuels, in order to run these steam turbines to give electricity to the grid. And it's more of switching over to these private businesses, which are responsible for producing these renewable resources, would basically be losing money for these bigger companies that are using fossil fuels to produce it. So, and they own the distribution network. So they don't want to let those renewable resources ride their bus to the people.
So we'll put our conspiracy hat on a little bit. Texas has its own electrical grid, and Texas has some very large gasoline companies, you'd say? Oil companies?
Yes, so, Texas is on top of one of the major places where we can get oil, actually, where oil is stored underground, and they have their own tech grid.
Let's talk about just how to improve the grid. New transmission lines handle different types of power, smart grid tech. We have the ability to. It's more about getting the mindset to it at this stage. Thank you for that, Christina. Let's jump over to Jamison. Nuclear is a potential solution that has gained some steam a lot recently, right? With certain companies, certain companies getting involved with investing in nuclear energy. 3 Mile Island is reportedly coming back online and is going to sell its energy only to Microsoft. And of course, you have Sam Altman's Oklo. They recently partnered with 2 data centers, and they're going to be delivering a ton of low carbon power. When it comes down to nuclear, why are we seeing it more and more right now? I can pass off our discussion here, but what are some of the advantages of nuclear energy as well?
Yeah, so I feel like I get all of the optimistic questions. Sorry for the other 2. I get to answer the fun ones. But let's see. In general, there's a whole bunch of advantages when it comes to nuclear. For one, there's the efficiency. We get nuclear energy kind of in the same way that we get a lot of our other non-renewable energy, like coal. It's all pretty much sort of a thermal process. We generate heat from a highly controlled chain reaction, and that generates steam, as Christina said, and that pushes turbines, and that creates electricity for the grid, basically, right? Using nuclear processes for this is a lot more efficient just because we're getting a lot more energy out of atoms than we are getting out of combustion with coal or with petroleum. And when it comes down to it, it's the high output from that. Very small amounts of nuclear fuel are going to provide immense amounts of energy, which is pretty suitable for tech-heavy industries because there's a lot of energy, as we've been talking about. There's also low carbon emissions. The carbon footprint for nuclear energy is pretty much no greenhouse gases generated during operation, which is pretty much in alignment with what our goals are for sustainability, right? In terms of reliability, as long as it operates consistently and you have people who know what they're doing in charge, it will continue to operate at a pretty even output. And unlike intermittent renewables like solar or wind, you don't have to rely on weather to actually get that energy, right? So it's stable base load energy for you right there. Last major advantage is going to be land efficiency. So nuclear plants don't necessarily require as much land compared to solar or wind farms for the same energy output. So there's a lot of advantages, and that's one of the reasons. The more people realize the advantages of it, the more people are going to be using it. Mostly, I would say, for its efficiency, but of course there are disadvantages as well.
There's a stigma for nuclear energy. I think whenever you hear nuclear energy, people want to avoid it. They get nervous about it. What is that? What is that stigma and why?
I would say the first reason is because of previous accidents that we've had when trying to contain nuclear reactions. So 3 Mile Island, for example, in the US, Chernobyl in Russia, Fukushima, all of those basically kind of raised public fears quite a bit because they were very heavily covered, and we got to see the fallout from those. Even despite improved modern safety standards that we have today, even learning lessons that we did from those disasters, people still are pretty afraid of it because that's what that's the first thing that comes to mind in a lot of cases when it comes to nuclear energy, I would say. Another issue is the risks of nuclear proliferation and how these kinds of reactions can be used for bad things, such as weapons, which of course is going to be in the public eye for sure, and has been for the past almost century now, I'd say, since 1938 when people discovered that, oh hey, fission is a thing that we can use. So yeah, definitely a big problem there for sure. Another issue would be cost, of course. I think out of any of the options that we've been discussing, I would say that nuclear energy tends to be the most difficult to start as well as the most difficult to stop in terms of expense. There's a lot of logistics that goes into creating a nuclear plant, and if someone needs to be powered down for any reason, there's a lot of issues with what we do with the nuclear waste, what we do with the land that's on there, and how exactly we can power it down safely and efficiently. So definitely big issues there, both for upfront and for decommissioning. And again, going back to management as well. Any kind of long-term storage for nuclear fuel, geologically stable solutions. Because fuel remains radioactive for thousands of years, we want to make sure that doesn't actually get into the environment, so we have to contain it completely, essentially. And then there's still a lot of research going on in this area, of course, but reprocessing options, the cost of doing research and trying to develop out ways for us to reuse this nuclear energy and turn it into something that we can possibly use again or recycle, that's still pretty heavily in development, I would say. So it's still expensive to actually do any research on that. So it all really comes down to money, honestly.
Yeah, you answered a lot of my questions proactively there, which is great. So obviously you have the weapons and you have all the disasters that have occurred. The waste management piece is the part that I have a tough time kind of wrapping my brain around as well. So they kind of just put it in these really fancy bags or bins or whatever and then put it underground. Is that how that goes? Can you probably enlighten me a little bit more on how that works and what's the downside if a leak occurs?
Right. So that has been the primary process, just because we don't know what else. We used to not really know what else to do with nuclear waste. We essentially found a spot where it would be able to stay for a long, long time, and we would just designate that as a nuclear waste site, and we would take all of our depleted or converted uranium there or plutonium there, and just have it kind of hang out and hope that nothing bad happens to the base of whatever storage that we're using. Nowadays, we see, based off of previous incidents, that isn't necessarily the best option, because there's a lot of things that can happen to the base of that storage. And if something does happen, for example, even just like a small crack in the foundation, that can start leaking nuclear radioactive waste into the environment, into water, which ends up being a bit of a larger issue than fracking, even, honestly. Like there's some pretty bad chemicals when it comes to fracking, but when it comes to having nuclear waste in your water, in drinking water, that's a bit of a larger issue for sure. Yeah. More recently, I would say we're using reprocessing techniques, and we're researching more reprocessing techniques where we take what was previously considered nuclear waste, and we actually convert it into other things, other fuel resources, or other ways to actually expend the energy that's still in that nuclear waste, and use that radioactivity for more good, essentially. It's like taking natural gas or oil and separating it into all of its various components that we use. Like we get plastic from oil. We don't just get gas from oil or gasoline from oil. We get a whole bunch of different stuff. And that's due to a lot of research in that area. And I think nuclear energy is going down that same route, where all of the byproducts that we have from that reaction, we can still put to good use. We just have to know how.
There you go. And then I think that'd be almost a no-brainer. Right now, the U.S. uses about 20% of its electricity mix as nuclear at this moment. Thank you for that. Charles, but before we dive into a little bit of hardware and more on the corporate side of things, are there any other solutions out there currently in terms of us being able to maybe trim down the amount of emissions that are going into the air or the water or whatever it may be?
I distinctly remember this headline from an article published by The Onion, which reads, "Scientists politely remind world that clean energy technology ready to go whenever." We know the answers. We know what we have to do. We know we need to update the power grid. Or the United States' power grid was almost entirely built around the World War II era and hasn't significantly been upgraded since. We know the disastrous impact of fossil fuels. We know the ways of implementing sustainable technology. We know what needs to be researched to make nuclear power much more viable. We know what to do. It costs money and requires collective will. It requires the regulatory bodies, the agencies that organize the research, and it requires money. It requires investment. We know what we have to do to make the world a cleaner place. We know what we have to do to improve the ways in which technology is being used. We just have to do it.
There's the blueprint. Whenever we're on these type of discussions and we come to a piece like this, it's money, right? It's collective agreement for the better. No, thank you for that, Charles. Christina, Charlie actually mentioned hardware earlier. What ways can this really influence energy consumption? And then maybe even on the software side?
So in terms of energy consumption, looking at two pieces of hardware, because I say those are the two main sources of where the energy is being eaten up. It's going to be the CPU and the GPU, which is also what the data centers are compounding that problem. Now, the average CPU is going to use, with numbers again, 150 to about 300 kilowatts of energy. That's about a third of the average New York City household. And that's just a run. And the normal GPU is going to use 14,000 gigawatts of energy. And this is for yearly consumption. So quite a large amount, compounded more so once we get to data centers, which each server rack, which is going to contain many essentially computers and storage devices just layered on each other so that way we can use it for cloud computing. Those are going to exacerbate the problem of that energy being used. And I'm not quite sure if there is a better solution for that hardware in terms of how we can minimize the amount of power that it's using. But moving forward from that, the software side is where we can actually see some types of improvement. The software is going to be dictating how much power each one of these devices is going to use. When you have a CPU in a computer, the operating system is a program that is responsible for dictating how much power is used by this device to operate, to check how often it's going to run, and what type of functionality it's going to perform. Minimizing larger power using functions is one of the easiest, most straightforward ways that we can minimize power production. So, for example, if we take training, which you mentioned earlier, uses, I forget the number you mentioned, but...
the training model, GPT-4 is 50 times more electricity than GPT-3?
Yes, and GPT-3 I know was 1,300 megawatt hour energies usage. This is the amount that's consumed annually by 130 US homes. So just to train GPT-3, minimizing how often we're training these large language models, how often we are updating it is the easiest way to minimize how much usage these AI companies are using in order to power the models.
Would going to smaller language models, would that help at all in some of these cases, or are they just going to get, when you get smaller ones, there's just more of them, and so you're back to where you started?
You see, I wouldn't push for a smaller model, because when you get a smaller model, you get more restricted capabilities of that model. Now, unless you are using it specifically for a fine-tuned model where it's only using specific queries and tasks, then absolutely, smaller model is the way to go, because it can be trained much quicker and is going to use much less data overall in its knowledge bases. But for like the everyday average user, they're not going to be using any type of pre-trained model. More likely than not, they're going to be looking for the online chatbots that we've been using so far, like ChatGPT or Claude. And those can't be smaller models. If they are smaller models, we're not going to get that general use case service that it provides. And that's honestly, even though it's not perfectly working at all, that is the biggest advantage of the model on the market right now.
Oh, thank you for that, Christina. Jamison, let me piggyback off of that last question to you here, right? When we're talking about these smaller models, AI agents, or when you get into the agentic AI, when they are more autonomous, let's see, looking into your crystal ball here, the general purpose large language models continue to grow, and then there's just more AI agents on top of it, and then what that results in is just more and more energy consumption.
I think there's a point where you get to diminishing returns with the larger language models, and I think we're kind of slowly realizing that. And that's actually one of the reasons for the shift to agentic AI. It's kind of a phase in all of these AI hype bubbles that have happened since the 50s or so, where we see, hey, we found this good general purpose use of this particular theory, and we have the hardware for it now. Now let's go ahead and customize that a little bit more for our own particular use case. And we won't need to train it as much because we have a good foundation model that's still small but really well trained. and now it can do this particular task or this series of tasks that's not as wide as what the larger language models can do with their more wider intelligence, but is still really good at doing this group of tasks, basically. So I would say that we're kind of seeing the end of this more general trend towards large language models. We'll probably be on it for another few years or so, but I think people can really tell, especially in the industry at this point, that they're kind of starting to see that they're essentially brute forcing a wall. They're just pushing against a wall, and they've found the wall, but now they have to figure out how to get around it. And I think that's gonna be another decade or so until the next big AI hype bubble, whatever that's gonna be about.
In tandem, we're also getting a limit of the amount of information that's available. As Charlie has shared previously, model collapse. So you're getting that factor as well, pushing it even more to these AI agents. Okay, interesting. Really good stuff. So now going to the last part of our discussion. Charles, what about corporate responsibility? Shouldn't there be more onus on them? How are they playing, or how is that playing a part? And what's missing?
Very recently, at time of recording this podcast, Microsoft announced that the latest version of Notepad would include an AI model. Also, the latest version of Microsoft Paint would include some generative features. Neither of these are things that anyone asked for or wanted. Notepad is a cheap, small text editor for jotting down your immediate thoughts. It does not need an AI model. Microsoft Paint is for doodling. If Microsoft wants to include a more complete piece of artistic software, perhaps they should have just included that with Windows. The push to put AI in everything is something that I can't help but think no one wants. No one really wants. If people want AI features, they will seek out AI in AI applications. The corporate push to put AI into everything is a part of the problem. There's a lack of understanding of what these tools are good for and what kinds of applications that would actually help the end user. So this kind of corporate responsibility is at the very least, we'd like them to try and think through, I'm just going to say it, like think through the things that they do, think through the products they make. The other thing that I kind of want to talk about, I have an article on LinkedIn about the need of object-oriented programming, and I had a brief aside that I really think I'm going to expand on, and that is about the energy consumption of programs themselves. And I feel like the standards of code are really low, a lot lower than they should be. Corporations have emphasized maintainability, which is good, but there really should be more of a push to maximize efficiency. I keep saying programs, but really this should be expanded to everything. Build products where energy consumption is a primary concern. You can't just assume that someone else will pay for it. You can't just assume, we don't have to worry about the energy consumption of this application because it's all just going to go onto our cloud bill anyway. You have to stop thinking like that. You have to really, from the ground up, you have to start assuming that the energy consumption of your constantly running tools is going to be a major concern moving forward. And we're really seeing like a collapse of the hiring market, let me put it that way, where there's a lot fewer programmers being hired. And I feel like this is an opportunity to hire people who really understand how to write efficient code, make efficient applications, and answer user need in the most efficient way possible. We talk about how expensive it is to train a model, but what if that was something that only needed to be done once? You have a data center, you plunk it right next to a nuclear plant, you train the model to do exactly what is needed to answer the most common user queries, and then using it is cheap. Because right now, that's the big problem. Training the model is expensive, using the model is expensive. What if we really think of ways that the using the model, which is going to be the most energy expensive, is going to be a cheap part? Don't use a model when you can use a lookup table, for example.
You're chatting here. I mean, I'm thinking also about, is there a little bit of AI fatigue? Is that hitting already? I was posting something on Instagram. You know, you make your comment or whatever it is. It says, have Gen AI auto-populate something for you. And I'm like, why do I need that? I'm on a training website. You can ask questions to the AI bot on the side about what I'm learning right in front of me. It's too much. And to your point, I mean, that's all wasted energy. We're talking about the use of all these queries, all these questions, all this training, all that goes into it, and it's everywhere. Charles, sticking with you then, would AI fatigue might just be a little bit of a good thing. Maybe we get to some foundational stuff, go back to the areas instead of just it being thrown at us at all times, to actually an efficient use of all these tools.
If you couldn't be bothered to write it, why should I be bothered to read it?
Mm-hmm. There you go.
And there you go. The overwhelming sense that I get is that when some company puts out promotional material with AI-generated art, the assumption of people is that this company was too cheap to hire a real artist. That there's this association of AI-produced content with cheapness and low quality because it is being marketed as something that is lower cost than hiring a person. So maybe that perspective is something that will, as you said, ultimately benefit the continued viability of the climate to support a human population.
Yeah, that makes sense too. I mean, even just you look at manufacturing locations or perception of cost and value off of that. You see a marketing thing and it has the word unleashed in it. I kind of stopped reading it after that. So, Charles, thank you for that. Jamison, we are going to leave off with you here. I know you talked about having all the positive pieces before. Well, now it's going to switch it around. Where does this blame fall? We just talked about users. We talked about companies, corporate responsibility, etc. Where does the blame fall at this moment for just the wild, wasted use of energy?
I am going to go in order of, descending responsibility. So those who are most responsible first, keeping this to the tech industry. So the tech industry, the companies who are part of the tech industry, the corporations who are using all of this power directly, they are going to be the ones who are going to be the most at fault here. But of course, when we're talking about that, we have to keep in consideration these companies aren't necessarily unpredictable. We know what exactly they're going to do because we know that they are the most successful companies in the tech industry for a reason. They're good at cutting corners. They're good at going cost efficient. They're good at making sure that they get as much money as they possibly can. That is why they are successful, right? And in doing so, they become extremely predictable. So I would say that it is their fault in most ways. It is their fault entirely, but it is because they are confined ideologically to making that much money. And because of that, because of those guidelines, we end up seeing repeated behaviors, let's put it, I would say, in terms of just trying to do as little as possible to spend money on research and development that doesn't necessarily benefit them directly and only them in a competitive environment. So it really, besides tech companies, besides the tech industry, it comes down to governments as well, to be able to offer more incentives to switch to renewable energy and sustainability-oriented practices. But they're often very slow at that, right? Because there's a lot of factors at play. I would say that's more of a complex subject than the behavior of tech industry companies, right? There are lobbyists from those tech industry companies who do not want to have to spend more money switching over, who are influencing different portions of the government. There are a lack of organization around green-oriented or green-centered movements. There is a laxness to the government in general when it comes to passing infrastructure laws, more logistics when it comes to creating infrastructure that actually helps out this entire process of switching over to more renewable energies and nuclear. And it's just kind of it's not just a gridlock, it's a raging gridlock. Think Manhattan at 5 p.m. on a Friday. It's not fun.
I don't want to be there.
Right? No. We also a couple of others. Energy providers, I would say, is another issue. They aren't necessarily just in the tech industry, right? They serve the tech industry, but they also serve a lot of other places. And on a larger scale, outside of just the tech industry, energy providers need to be incentivized and regulated in terms of this as well. Because if they're not, then they follow the same path as the tech companies, because they are also corporations. And they also want to make as much money as possible without spending too much money, right? And the last that we have is users. I personally am of the belief that we should not put the blame on individuals who are simply consumers of a product that they are not as familiar with as the people who make that product. I think that you should be doing your research, you should be reading, you should be aware of the things that you are using. But the blame doesn't necessarily fall on the individual. That being said, read more, be aware of what you're doing when you are being a user or a consumer of this particular technology, and understand what is happening on a more mass scale when it's not just you who's doing it.
There we go. Well, nicely said, Jamison. Charles, Christina, Jamison, this has been quite a discussion. For Codex, I'm Rich Bowers. Take care, everybody.
See ya.
Bye.